to the What Bitcoin Did podcast.
Hello there from Brooklyn, New York. How are you all? Welcome to the What Bitcoin Did podcast, brought to you by Kraken. I'm your host, Peter McCormack, and today I've got a monster interview. I've got the one and only Andreas M. Antonopoulos. But before that, I have a message from my show sponsors. So let's talk about my new sponsor, Kraken, and I've signed up. I've done it. I've dumped my Coinbase account. I've signed up for Kraken. I submitted my KYC. And I was actually verified for my Tier 3 account within under 2 hours, which is pretty cool. It wasn't a special favor. I didn't let them know I was doing it. I just submitted it Friday morning. 2 hours later, I got my approval, which is pretty cool. So next up, I'm going to be using Kraken for all of my buying and selling of Bitcoin. I will feedback to you on this. I'll talk to you about my experience and what I've learned. And in the meantime, I highly recommend you check out the new Kraken podcast, How to Grow a Decacorn. I listened to the first 2 episodes on my flight on the way over. They discuss the challenges of growing a company to a $10 billion valuation target. And they also talk about their purchase of the crypto derivatives trading platform, Crypto Facilities, which made Kraken the first exchange to offer both spot and futures trading. So come on, with all the recent Coinbase nonsense, I think we all know that Kraken are a much better option. So head over there, head over to kraken.com, which is Kraken.com. And also, if you want to listen to this podcast I spoke about, it's on iTunes, it's on Spotify, it's on Google, and it's on YouTube. Just search for How to Grow a Decacorn. Decacorn is spelled Decacorn. And next up, let's talk about my friends at BlockFi. And as I said, I'm in Brooklyn. I got here last night and I'm heading over to Manhattan in a couple of hours. I'm heading over to the BlockFi office to catch up with Zach because we're going to be talking about their new product launch, which I can tell you about right now. And it's really, really cool. So BlockFi have launched interest accounts offering 6.2% compounded interest to cryptocurrency holders. Yes, an interest account. How cool is that? The next step in the BlockFi journey of expanding banking services with crypto is live, and they are the only provider offering compound interest on crypto deposits structured similar to a high-interest savings account. They're offering the highest interest rates on Bitcoin and ETH in the market. Interest is earned in the deposited cryptocurrency, so you earn BTC on your BTC deposits. There are no lock-in periods for your deposits, and client assets are custodied at Gemini, who recently announced their digital asset insurance coverage and the completion of its SOC 2 Type 1 security compliance review of its exchange and custodian platform. I really love BlockFi. I love this. I think it's so cool. I really can't wait to get over there and talk to them about it. If you want to check it out, head over to blockfi.com, which is BLOCKFI.com. Okay, so onto the interview with Andreas, someone who doesn't really need much of an introduction. You will know him. Someone I've been chasing down for about a year. And then halfway through a meme thread on Twitter the other day, I made a joke and he checked out my profile, falls for the bait, thinks I'm an ICO advisor, dogs me out, but then a bunch of people said to him he should come on the show, which was really awesome. Such a funny way to get him onto the show in the end. And it was funny because as I booked it, I then didn't know where to start. I didn't know actually what I wanted to talk to him about because, as I said to him, most people you interview have got a niche. You know, if you interview Fluffy Pony, you know, you're going to talk about Monero and privacy. But Andreas talks about so many different things and he's got such a broad experience. I really didn't know where to start. And funny enough, I actually think I should have just freestyled this one without any script, without any questions, and just gone in for it because it was such an easy conversation. So I really enjoyed this. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. You know, if you've got any questions, you can email me. My email address is hello@whatbitcoindid. And if you're enjoying the show and you want to support it, head over to whatbitcoindid.com and click on the support section. There's a whole bunch of things there you can do to help me out. And yeah, I hope you enjoy the interview. As I said, if you've got any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is hello@whatbitcoindid.com. Hello, Andreas. How are you?
I'm doing great, Peter. How are you today?
I'm very good, thank you. So I've been trying to get your attention for about a year now and finally managed it. Well, somebody else managed it for me with a giant hairy ass. So here we are.
There's this little corner of crypto Twitter that is relentlessly silly, and I absolutely love it because it gives me a break from all of the seriousness and all of the nastiness that goes on often. And so this being Crypto Euclid and his gang of merry friends. And I did end up in that thread. And it was just a meme factory for like 2 hours. And, you know, so sometimes weird things get my attention, right?
Yeah. And now you're going to come and be a advisor on my ICO, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, of course. Are you monetizing hairy asses or was that a side job?
I'm putting hairy asses on the blockchain.
Yeah, well, that's really where they belong.
So it's funny, actually. I've obviously wanted to interview you ever since I started. And then once you agreed and I heard from you, then I was like, shit, I don't know what I'm going to talk to you about, because everybody else I interview is usually in a niche, right? They're like, when I interview Zuko, it's Zcash, so it's privacy. But with you, there's so much, and unlike everybody else, I've watched hundreds of your videos and followed your Twitter, and then I'm like, how do you know so much? Yeah, well, no, it's fine. I mean, I've learned so much from it, but how do you know so much stuff
about crypto or
everything? Just everything. You seem to know exactly how the world works, how money works, how the economy works. I don't want an origin story, but what are all these influences that got you to here?
Well, I do have a weird path. Then again, everybody does. I've been tremendously lucky in my life and have found myself following a very, very bizarre path to where I am today. Started off as a middle-class kid in Greece during a dictatorship, currency crisis environment. That certainly influenced me a lot. I think probably one of the biggest influences in my learning and my desire for knowledge have been my parents, who are both very, very much all about education, but especially my mother, who was a huge book reader. And so I grew up in a house, and this is probably the biggest influence I've had. I grew up in a house where every single room had wall to wall, ceiling to floor bookcases that were filled with books. Probably a fire hazard, but a learning environment, one in which, and not just serious books, the whole range, from the silly to the trashy to the very serious to the classics. And it was an environment in which everyone was reading all the time, and reading was seen as an important activity. So even though when I was young, I didn't read as much, once I was an adult, I started reading voraciously, and it's only increased. So I read 2 to 3 books a week, and I dedicate a lot of time to reading across a whole range, including, from the trashy to the serious, technical, non-technical, fiction, non-fiction, biography, history, geography, business, but also trashy sci-fi and ridiculous books. And I just love reading. It's the reason I love learning about new subjects. It's also the reason that I became an author, because I love words. It's the reason I think I do a good job as a public speaker. Words are just such an important part of my life.
What are you reading right now?
What am I reading? Well, so generally I'm usually reading 2 or 3 books simultaneously. So I'll flip from one to another. And I'd have to pull up my Kindle to tell you specifically. So I'm reading a book called The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, which is about how much of our behavior in life is driven by an underlying fear of death and facing our mortality. It's part of a series of books I'm reading now about aging and mortality, in order to understand my own journey in that. I'm reading a book called Boundaries, which is about how to manage expectations and boundaries in interpersonal relationships. I'm reading The Killer Collective by Barry Eisler, which is a spy thriller. I'm reading Charles Stross' The Labyrinth Index, which is part of his Atrocity Archives Magic and Zombies book as computational, as higher order computational math, and across the range, right? So if I want to learn something, probably the first thing I do is buy 2 or 3 books. I want to be better at project management. I'll buy 2 or 3 books. I want to learn more about statistics. I'll buy 2 or 3 books. I'm trying to develop my comedy timing for my public speaking, for example. I read 2 or 3 books on that subject. So that's my go-to.
Right, okay. All right, so give me one book that I will never have read that I should read. I've got to go and buy now. I've got to get a flight to New York on Sunday, so give me a book to read.
I think that's a very, very personal question, and it depends on what level of reading you do and what you enjoy. But I would say, bar anything else, find something that you think will be fun. Reading shouldn't be about a goal. It should be about the process, right? It shouldn't be about getting somewhere. It should be about the time you spend in the book and enjoying that time. And the more you enjoy the stuff you're reading, the more you read, and then the more you'll enjoy the new things you read. So really, as a personal piece of advice, find a book that you think you're going to really enjoy and use that to enhance your reading.
Do you know what? I don't enjoy any books, though. I enjoy film. I'm like, I love film. So I get on a plane, I want to watch 2 or 3 films.
There's nothing wrong with that. I don't want to be a book snob here. For every person has their own learning mode, right? Some people are very visual. Language happens to work for me. That doesn't mean it's for everyone.
Right. Well, we should really talk about some Bitcoin, really, because this is why we're here.
Why not? Sure.
Why not? So look. Firstly, what are the unsolvable problems in an open, decentralized, public, transparent, neutral, censorship-resistant, global, trustless network platform? I saw that earlier. No, I just winded you up.
The unsolvable problems.
I'm only joking.
Well, I can tell you what the unsolvable problems.
Go on then, shoot.
Human nature. And there's this assumption that I see floating around a lot, especially around technologists, that you can solve deep-seated social problems and really societal problems, which are squarely in the area of sociology and are deeply rooted in human behavior and human motives and human biology, really. And that you can solve these with technology. You can't change humanity with technology. Well, you can, but you can't change the deep-rooted human behavior characteristics, or some of them at least. And it's naive to think you can. So bad behavior will always exist. You're not going to eradicate that. Irrational behavior will always exist. Emotional behavior will always exist. And you can't change that. You can't turn people into cold, rational actors just because you introduce a different form of money or you use a new organizational model for blockchains.
Well, that made me think of something, because I was watching one of your presentations and you were talking about cartels, the banking cartels. And how they've got away with so much. And I was like thinking, is this one sinister organized system, or is it just the sum of a bunch of bad people making bad decisions?
It's not even the sum of bad people making bad decisions. It's the sum of good people and bad people, very few bad people, mostly good people, stuck in organizational structures and institutions that collectively and in aggregate guide towards decisions that are not particularly bad necessarily, but are amoral. They have no moral compass. They towards good or bad, they simply follow a different set of guidelines, mostly profit driven. And because the distance between the decision maker and those affected by those decisions is greater and greater in these hierarchies, and because of the dilution of responsibility, where each person contributes a tiny part and they don't see the big picture, you end up with organizations that act in ways that go against good outcomes in society. And it's not about bad people. If it was, it would be easier to solve. It's about the architecture of the system that leads to good people making tiny decisions that in aggregate and through the institution become very, very negative for society. And that's a problem that's much harder to solve.
So I guess there's a lot of temptation that comes in with that as well.
But it's not, yeah, well, that may be the case for some of the bad actors, the immoral actors, the narcissists, the people who are sociopaths and lack empathy and rise to the top of these organizations. But again, that's a systemic issue. It's not about personal decisions. The average banker, the average person who works at a bank, even those highly placed, is a perfectly nice person who on a day-to-day basis is making choices for the betterment of humanity, but mostly to pay their mortgage and raise their kids and create a good environment for their family. It's the system they work in that produces bad outcomes. So it's very important to distinguish between the two, because if you take this Manichaean approach of good versus evil, it clouds judgment. There are no easy answers. And if you take a simplistic black and white view of the world where there are good people doing good things and there are bad people doing bad things, well, that would be a hell of a lot easier to fix. You just find the bad people. But that's not the case. The problem with the world, I think, is when good people make bad choices or their decisions add up to bad outcomes without wanting to, or where they can be manipulated and corrupted by bad people who gain power. So those are much more complex problems to solve. They don't have simple solutions. They're not simple to understand or analyze. And and that's why it's satisfying and also easier to just go for a black and white view of the world, right? A simplistic view of the world where the bad things happen because bad people do bad things deliberately. That's very, very rarely the case. There are such cases, of course. Pure malice does exist. There are disturbed people who deliberately do things to hurt others, but they're such a vanishingly small percentage, and they can't account for most of the evil that happens in the world. Most of the evil happens in the world happens because good people are not aware of the impact of their actions and are not taking enough interest and personal responsibility to change those.
But what would you say, therefore, in this failed or failing system that doesn't work? What are the pillars of the architecture that cause the problems?
Well, the primary issue, and I look at this architecturally, is that of scaling. And we've got to remember that banking institutions today were enormously liberalizing institutions for the vast majority of the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. Before the introduction of retail banking, people banking that was introduced in the 15th, 16th century, the only people who had access to banking were princes and kings. So you had to be a member of the royal aristocracy, not even lower member, you had to be a higher member of the aristocracy. The only person who could write a check was a king, right? Drawn on the treasury. So these institutions, which were started by a merchant class in medieval Europe that was very, very strongly persecuted by the aristocracy for making banking available to the masses, and which in many cases had historical implications beyond that. These institutions freed up billions of people, literally gave freedom to billions of people by empowering them to join in corporations, associations, to manage their money, to have free commerce, to be able to save, to have banking for the masses. At some point, however, the institutions themselves, because they're scaling in a hierarchical model, in the form of a pyramid structure, the industrial model of bureaucratic organization, where you have layers and layers and layers and layers, in order to scale an organization, that scale collapses at some point. At some point, the distance between the decision makers at the top of the pyramid and the people affected by those decisions at the bottom becomes too great. The responsibility is too dilute, and the organization fails to make good decisions. So it's an architecture problem. And the way it's solved is by decentralized flat architectures that are enabled by software, where governance is done on a network rather than through a bureaucracy. So bureaucracies are the great invention of the 18th century. Banking is the great invention of the 16th century. Those inventions raised billions out of poverty, and they were great. And now they failed to scale. And now we need new institutions to survive the 21st century without destroying our planet.
And is Bitcoin one of those?
Bitcoin is absolutely one of those. And it is one of those because of its decentralized flat governance model.
All right. Well, look, we're 10 years in now. Where do you kind of see it? Like, if you look at the last 10 years and then try and picture forward, where do you kind of see us in the journey of Bitcoin and how Bitcoin can change things?
Oh, I think we're making tremendous progress. The technology has proven to be enormously resilient, surprising me many times with its resilience. It's been attacked both from the outside and the inside a number of times by different power structures and embedded interests, both within and without the crypto space. And it's managed to repel these attacks and maintain the fundamental structure. It's very resistant to change, which is a huge benefit once you see these attacks happening. And it's also spawned, thousands of imitators, some of which are actually doing interesting things in the periphery that also benefit it. So, I think it's going pretty well, better than I expected.
So there's a question I ask a lot of my interviews, and I know you've answered it before, but the first time I heard it was actually asked to Adam Back, and I love the different responses I get. So before we go on, I just want to ask you what is Bitcoin? Because this leads us on to a bunch of other things.
It depends the context which I'm answering that question and the audience I'm answering that question. I would say Bitcoin is the fifth evolution of money. In its most abstract form, coupled to a new governance model that delivers the purest form of network governance we've ever seen.
And I'm guessing you believe, therefore, it can become, I mean, I guess it already is a global currency of sorts, but do you actually see a scenario where it becomes the primary currency within certain countries or all countries?
I don't know yet. And that depends on many other factors, many of which are externalities. It depends on what fiat does across the globe in the meantime. I don't think that's necessarily a very good goal, because in some cases, I think certain types of mainstreaming of this technology require compromises that I personally wouldn't make. And so I would rather see something that is a bit less mainstream and a bit more niche, but delivers the maximum amount of freedom and empowerment for the people who use it, and becomes a choice that is available and resistant to capture, than to see it become endorsed by governments, endorsed by banks, mainstreamed to people who care less about privacy and monetary soundness and decentralization of power. So if the price of mainstream is compromising on those principles, I'll pass, on mainstreaming. It doesn't matter. I define success differently. I define success as maintaining its resilience and building even better privacy to deliver more power to individuals around the world to use it as a choice if they need it. And depending on how fiat goes, more and more people may end up needing it. So that's a whole other issue.
But therefore, you see it having a symbiotic relationship with fiat.
Absolutely. I think that there are many reasons why people choose to use currency, and not all of them are rational or based on sound monetary policies. People have irrational approaches, including being influenced by nationalism, by tribalism, by various other instincts that make them or guide them to making a choice that is not perhaps in their best interest, but satisfies other emotional needs, belonging in group thinking, things like that. And if you account for these externalities and you also account for the friction in changing systems that already exist, that means we're likely to have an environment in which all of these systems coexist for quite a while, if not permanently, for the same reason that even if you have a dominant language that is very, very useful to the vast majority of the human population, that doesn't eradicate all other languages. Even if you have a dominant religion that seems to satisfy the spiritual needs of most people, that doesn't eradicate all of the others. In fact, if anything, they're increasing. And finally, in terms of currencies, even if Bitcoin has a dominant position in a power law distribution, it captures a very big percentage of the market. That doesn't eradicate all of the other things that might exist. I'm comfortable with these things coexisting. We're 25 years into the internet, but I can still find fax machines out there, mostly in government offices. They serve a purpose for those who use them, right? I don't agree. I wouldn't use them, but they're not going away. There are still horses on the street being used as transportation as well as mechanical work, right? Why, after 200 years of industrialization, are we still using beasts of burden? Because things don't happen in equal measure everywhere, and because there are other reasons why people make those choices.
Okay, so if they coexist, then I guess Bitcoin is a couple of things really. It's a tool, obviously, for sending value around the world, hopefully transacting privately on occasion, but it's also an assurance against fiat.
Absolutely, it's an exit. It's an escape valve. It's a lifeboat. And the thing about lifeboats is that you hope you don't need them, if anything. Um, it's nice to live in countries where the currency has problems, but it still works, right? And I don't believe in blowing a hole in your ship because you think it's not as structurally sound just to see if you can test the lifeboats. I want them to be there, but I don't necessarily wish that everybody only uses those. So I see Bitcoin as a lifeboat. And in fact, a lot of its power comes simply from the fact that it exists as a choice ready to be exercised. And that constrains the options of those who are trying to create a monopoly vision of the world where those choices are fixed, right? So if you're a dictator who's decided to go, to go fully committed to some kind of crazy policy that leads to hyperinflation, well, if you can take your population hostage and close the borders and impose currency controls, then your power is maximal. But if you are constrained, because you know that as soon as you start doing that, people will start exiting, which will start drawing power out of your currency, then your choices are constrained. And so you may not even choose to create the conditions that would require a lifeboat. The fact that it simply exists prevents you from doing it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's powerful. If the next hyperinflation country doesn't go hyperinflation because long before it does, people start exiting in large enough numbers, or the leaders know they might, that changes the power dynamic between people and their government. And that's an important role.
Okay, so it's an insurance, but it's also, I guess it's a carrot for dictators, but I think we're a long way from seeing that. But it is also a tool. I'll give you a great example this week, Andreas. So I was out in Japan a week and a half ago to interview Mark Cartels, and I had to hire a cameraman because I videoed the interview. And I haven't paid him yet because I tried to pay him from my bank in the UK to him in Japan, and it just wouldn't work. It just wouldn't work. I had the information.
Won't work. Yeah,
it just won't work.
That's a use case that anybody who operates on an international market already understands.
Yeah, but I've got somebody who had to pay me from Hong Kong. They sent me the Bitcoin. I think it confirmed within it was just less than an hour. I've then sold it on an exchange, and I've transferred it to my bank account. I think from their Bitcoin to my bank account, it's been 3 or 4 hours.
And that's if you count the time to convert from fiat. I do a lot of work with partners and suppliers and my staff who earn, spend, and use crypto directly and don't convert it to fiat. So that process is now down to about 10 minutes for international fulfillment and settlement of invoices. I get paid and I pay others. And I'm not converting from fiat. I'm not converting to fiat. And as a result, by living most of the time in the crypto environment for my businesses, I'm down to 10 minutes, seamless, frictionless international commerce, the style of which we haven't seen since the early 17th century.
Yeah.
We're back to the type of international commerce that was enabled by, gold florin coins in the Venetian Renaissance. And it's beautiful because it means that it's a lot easier to operate as a truly multinational company, a multinational company that has less than 10 people, but truly operates across borders. Every time I try to do a wire transfer, something goes wrong. It usually takes weeks, unless it's one of the recurring payments that I have from one of my clients. We've already gone through those hurdles. If I try to do a new one to a new person, it's weeks. The longest has been 7 months to get a payment to a translator who translated one of my books into Russian. And, that system's broken. And what most people don't realize is the kind of impact that has on international commerce.
So would you say we're just scratching the surface of the possibilities here? Because, I mean, you're doing it and I'm doing it, but there must be benefits out there to hundreds of companies, thousands, tens of thousands.
Absolutely. We are, and I've used this metaphor before, but this is a bit like using FTP on the internet in 1991, 1992. You can see the benefits. You can we can now move data across the world in minutes, something that was not possible before. But, that's not the web or Netflix embedded in your TV, that's going to happen. So we're barely scratching the surface. We're the early pioneers dealing with the very kludgy interfaces that just about barely work to do what we need them to do. And we can see within that a vision of what could happen and will happen if this technology is developed and matured and polished and reaches mass access. That's really where we are. It's still very early days.
But you found a flaw in my process in that I've done the conversion back to fiat rather than just staying in Bitcoin. So if significant numbers of companies around the world, hundreds of thousands, start moving value around in Bitcoin and not converting back to their local fiat currency, what actually happens then? Like, what happens when Bitcoin starts taking over?
Well, even if they do convert, the more volume of transactions we see, the more liquidity we see, the more people moving money regularly, that's going to have an immediate impact on volatility. The market, as it gets bigger, becomes harder and harder to budge. And when people are making long-term decisions and using this as part of their business and embedding it into their accounting systems, that changes the attitude towards this. It becomes less speculation and more medium of exchange. And at that point, I think we'll see a very rapid drop in volatility. This is one of those chicken and egg problems. Bitcoin's volatile because it doesn't have enough adoption. It doesn't have enough adoption because it's volatile. And people say, well, how could it ever be adopted if it's volatile? And that's a bit like asking, how could it ever be big if it's small? Because volatility is a symptom of size. So when it's big, it won't have volatility. And it will no longer be small as a result. So it's a cyclical argument, if you see. And part of that means that in order for it to reach adoption, there have to be motivations that overcome the initial difficulty of dealing with volatility. And those motivations exist in plenty parts of the world where either the local currency is more volatile or other elements of friction in international commerce, particular use cases and needs of censorability, immutability, cross-border transactions, refugees, hyperinflation, et cetera. All of those things create conditions where the need is greater than the temporary inconvenience of volatility and difficult user interface, et cetera. So that's how adoption starts. And as that adoption grows, it drives down volatility, which opens up the door for more people to adopt who have less friction, who then drive volatility down until eventually the friction drops to zero. What
else happens then? So if Bitcoin takes over, like, what are the other areas? What's the kind of chain effect? What happens to governments, markets? What happens to companies? What happens? Like, is it like a chain effect across the world that changes everything?
I think it has very, very significant and deep implications. And primarily because I see Bitcoin as the next evolution of the internet. Meaning I see this as part of the internet, an evolution of the internet. It's the internet plus the internet of money, the internet of value, adding another dimension, if you like, to the internet. So the internet started with data. Then it became communication. Then it became socialization. And now with crypto, I think it becomes the internet of commerce, the internet of value, the internet of money. And so what implications will yet another evolution of the internet have on the world? Enormous implications, just like the previous 2 or 3 evolutions of the internet. This is much deeper than simply it's simultaneously much deeper than just money, and at the same time, just money is an enormous killer application that affects every aspect of society and is often underestimated. So it's impossible to predict the implications it has. We're talking about a change in the way humanity organizes. The previous time we had a change, we've only had 3, right? So hunter-gatherer, agricultural society, industrialized society. And now we're seeing the first 25 years of transitioning into an information society. And part of that is changing our form of money to conform with the rest of our information society. And what implications will it have? Bigger implications than the Industrial Revolution. It doesn't just change society, it changes humanity. And that's not because of Bitcoin. It's because of a deeper transition to an information civilization.
Yeah, it's funny because when I talk to my friends about it and they're like, what is Bitcoin, Pete? And I'm like, well, I used to be like, it's money and it's digital gold. But now I've started, and I think this is the big influence has been Lightning Network for me. I now just see it as a financial infrastructure.
Yes.
Which you just plug yourself into.
And that's just the next wave. And then you start seeing it more broadly as a governance infrastructure, of which finance is one part, a very important part. But it starts putting tendrils in other aspects of governance, not just commerce. It's a bit like trying to explain the internet. And again, I keep going back to this because that's been one of the forming experiences of my life, was growing up with not the internet, then the early internet, then everybody having it, right? So I watched that transition. And it formed my experience, because when I was trying to explain the internet to people in 1989 or 1990, the best explanation I could have is, well, it's about moving data around, kind of like the post office, only instantaneous and digital, right? And that in itself was radical and earth-shattering. Right, the ability to move data around, but it didn't even begin to scratch the surface of what was going to happen next. So that's the same problem we have now, which is that if you really express the full vision of where you see this going, you immediately get classified as a kook. Right? People can't handle that much change in that short period of time. And I'm quite comfortable being the kook. I've been there. My entire internet experience was me shouting from the rooftops as a 16 and 17-year-old, "This'll change the world." And the response I get, "Do your homework and clean your room." but this will change the world. Yeah, eat your vegetables. And I still feel that enthusiasm with Bitcoin is just I don't have to clean my room anymore. I'm taking it a bit more seriously now as an adult. Not very seriously. It depends who I'm talking to.
Next up, I talked to Andreas more about Bitcoin use cases and aha moments with it. But before that, I have a message from my show sponsors. So come on, let's talk about this amazing new announcement from BlockFi again. As I've said so many times, I personally really love any company in the space which is building innovative products or trying to merge the world of crypto and non-crypto. I think this is where it becomes super useful and the market has an opportunity to grow. So I'm always watching out for that. And luckily, every one of my sponsors does this. So that's super cool. So BlockFi for me have excited me from the first moment I discovered them, not just because they're an advertiser. When I spoke with Zach Prince, which was episode 51, his kind of insights into a future world of crypto and banking really excited the hell out of me. I just thought it was super cool. And he talked about these new products coming, which was really exciting. And first one's here now. They've announced their interest accounts, which I think is super cool. It's pretty much a high interest savings account, but with crypto. They are the only provider offering compound interest on crypto deposits. They offer the highest interest rates on Bitcoin and ETH in the market. Interest is earned in your deposit currency. So if it's Bitcoin you've got deposited, you earn Bitcoin. There are no lock-in periods for your deposits, and client assets are custodied by Gemini, who recently announced their digital asset insurance coverage and the completion of its SOC 2 Type 1 security compliance review of its exchange and custodian platform. I think it's super cool. Like I said, I'm going to sign up. I'm going to use it. I'm going to feedback for it. I'm also heading over to the BlockFi office in a couple of hours. We're going to go and talk about this. I'm going to find out a whole bunch more, and I'll be sharing that with you in the future weeks. So yeah, make sure you go and check it out. Head over to blockfi.com, which is blockfi.com. And we also need to talk about Cash App again. All right, come on. Have you downloaded it yet? I've got it. I've got it on my phone. It's so cool. It's so amazing. It's like the easiest thing to use. So easy to be sending people money back and forth. I love it. I'm going to be using it now in future for sending friends money. I've actually got one to sign up, which was cool because I had to send him some money. So that was a super cool experience. And Cash App is the first traditional peer-to-peer payments app to support Bitcoin. Another cool thing, another thing I love about them. It comes with all the features of a traditional bank account. You've got the ability to direct deposit your paycheck into the app. You get a physical, customizable debit card, which is linked to spend from. And you also have the ability to earn 10% interest back at places like Whole Foods with their cash boots. And that can be used in tandem with your Bitcoin balance. There isn't an app like it on the market. Come on, go and download it. Give it a go. The experience of buying and selling Bitcoin is so easy. It literally requires only 2 clicks and you always receive your Bitcoin instantly. And they are committed to supporting the Bitcoin ecosystem. Go check out Jack on Twitter. Go and see, set up his Carson node. I think it's so cool to follow that as well, by the way. It's available on the Apple and Google Play stores. You can find it by searching for Cash App, which is CASHAPP. Just a note though, the Bitcoin buying and selling is only available in the US right now. We talked about at the start, we're 10 years in and you know, you've been blown away by how resilient it is and the attacks it survived. But, you know, it's still very early days. Like if you sat me in a room with like 10 of my friends, I'm the one who knows about Bitcoin and maybe one other will have bought some at some point and the rest just kind of don't know about it or don't understand it. And actually, they find it really difficult to understand what it is. And sometimes I find it difficult to really articulate what it is. So,
yes,
like in your eyes, how do we... It's easy for someone like you or me because I was there with the early internet. You know, I used to build things online or learn HTML. We're the kind of people who go and try and figure stuff out. You more so than me. But how do we bring everyone on board? Because it isn't easy, right?
we don't. I mean, that's the other thing, which is one of the things I've learned from long experience with technology and also kind of, you know, I see myself as a technology educator, but I often get called a technology evangelist. And I think that's the wrong way to look at it, because evangelism is about promoting something that is based on faith and opinion rather than facts, and persuading others to see a truth that they haven't discovered on their own. And I think that's the wrong way to go about a technology, especially a technology as important and critical to society as money. The truth is that many people don't need Bitcoin, especially in the affluent Western societies that we tend to spend most of our time in, right? Mm-hmm. And so why persuade them? You know, it's a technological curiosity for most of the people in the places we live. Now, you go to places where that's not the case, and I try to visit and spend most of my time in developing nations, in nations that are facing economic crises, in places where this stuff is really necessary. There's no persuasion needed. It's unnecessary to persuade anyone. They already understand. Here you have to overcome all of these cultural assumptions that exist, which are based on more than 2-3 centuries of business as usual in terms of who runs money, how money works, what money is, how government works, expectations, institutions, and institutions that are, quite honestly, fairly robust, have survived for a fairly long time, and not perfect, not scaling particularly well, but at the same time, not completely failed. So why replace them? You know, people are not comfortable with change. So, you know, the average American who has a Visa card and a bank account and an investment portfolio or something like that, it's difficult to persuade them that that system is broken, because for them it isn't. Now, if only the other 90% of the planet could have that level of privilege, but that's not the case. So the question is, why do the people in the other 90% of the world, the other 90% of the population, need this? And you don't need to tell them. You need to ask them, right? And listen and learn from that. And I find these enormously invigorating, these experiences where I go to places, most recently Argentina, where I spent a couple of months this winter, again, for the fourth time, is sit down, shut up, and listen and ask and learn. How are you using it? Where are you using it? Why are you using it? What can you tell me about it? And sometimes I learn things that surprise me. Often I learn things that surprise me. And that's not the job of an evangelist. That is the job of someone who teaches in order to learn and learns in order to teach. And that involves really looking at people have different needs, and they will use this technology for different reasons, often not the ones you intended it for, right? And that's fine.
It's not peer-to-peer electronic cash.
Yeah, maybe peer-to-peer electronic cash happens later. In some places it's happening now, but it requires a different set of friction points in order to happen, right? Bitcoin is most definitely not peer-to-peer electronic cash in North America and Western Europe. Why? Because it's not necessary. Because we already have very wide availability of fairly robust, stable currencies that are almost entirely digital and can be transmitted just as easily at equivalent or lower cost, with better interfaces and better security models. Centralized, yes, with a massive cost in our democracy and the capture of our institutions, yes, but those are side effects that are not easily noticed. The average experience of the person swiping a card to get a cup of coffee is perfectly fine, and they don't see any reason to change it. And trying to persuade them doesn't help Bitcoin adoption, right? It just makes us look like Ponzi scheme, pyramid scheme weirdos who are trying to recruit more bag holders, right? And it's unnecessary. In fact, I try to actively discourage that.
So what are you finding in places like Argentina? What are the things that you're hearing about that surprise you?
Well, my experience has been that cryptocurrency is best experienced and explained. Doesn't matter how it works, doesn't matter why it works. For the people who need it, all that matters is that it does work and that it solves a specific friction point they have. And once they experience that it solves that problem, at that point, they'll start asking questions. I've experienced that with contractors who I've paid in crypto, and in their country, they've compared that to the experience they've had with PayPal or bank wire transfers, and that is persuasive enough. Generally, the trick I've used, not trick, the method I've used to help demonstrate that is, listen, I'm not going to try and pay you your salary or your services in crypto, because, among other things, as a British person going to a developing nation and trying to pay people in what they perceive as colored beads has a very, very long history of being unacceptable and generates enormous skepticism. If I, as a British person, go to an Indian and say, hey, would you like me to pay in this magic internet money? They're like, oh, we remember. But what I can do often, and I do often, is I can structure a bonus. So money that is found, not earned, like extra money that you didn't expect. I'm like, hey, I'm going to give you and in my case, I did it with a subcontractor. I've done it several times, but I did it most recently with one of my subcontractors who does audio, video, and it was Diwali, which is the festival of the lights, kind of Christmassy time. And I was like, I'm going to give you a bonus, approximately 1 month's worth of pay for the work they were doing previously. But I can give you this bonus in crypto. And here's a set of instructions on how to go on local Bitcoins and find someone who you can meet in a public place and go and exchange this into rupees. And they do. And they find that because Bitcoin is selling at a premium of between 25 and 40% in India, depending on the location and the service, the effective transfer fee compared to PayPal goes from approximately 5% to approximately minus 30%. Meaning they got $200, they sold it for $240, and the transfer earned them money. Now, that experience is self-demonstrating, meaning that once they do it once, inevitably and invariably, they come back to me a month later and they say, well, could I do half PayPal, half crypto? There's a bit of skepticism still. It worked once, but surely this is a scam or a scheme or some weird thing. It's probably going to fail next time. They risk a bit more and a bit more and a bit more. And within about 6 months, all of their pay is in crypto, and they're cursing PayPal and watching my videos. So that's how I do that kind of education, because I think it's something where the facts matter and they speak for themselves. And there may be cases where people say it's not worth the risk for me to do this, and that's okay. I will accept and pay in any currency that works for my partners, and I'm not going to be ideological about this. I take a very pragmatic view. What currencies do I accept? Anything that I can convert to the store value of my choice or the investments of my choice. That includes fiat, it includes Doge, it includes a whole handful of cryptocurrencies that are easy and liquids that I can exchange with little risk. And I will pay people in whatever the fuck they want, depending on what needs they have, and can exchange liquidly themselves. I'm not going to take doctrinal positions on that.
But even Ripple coin?
No one's asked me for it or asked to give me it. And if I could find a way to exchange it liquidly without too many privacy and security risks, I don't see why not.
Okay, we'll pass on that one. I think what it is, Andreas, I think you need a aha moment. And I think most people who've bought and sold and traded Bitcoin, they haven't even had one, right? Like, I've only had my first one recently where it genuinely made a difference to me.
Yeah.
Okay, so my first aha moment actually kind of got me into it, where I had to buy a treatment for my mother that was illegal, but I kind of forgot about that. And then I held Bitcoin, and then I lost Bitcoin, and I traded it, and blah blah. All this stuff happened, and then
you've been through the roller coaster.
Yeah, I've been through the roller coaster of having loads and then losing pretty much all of it. But I then had another aha moment recently where it was much easier to be paid in Bitcoin, and now I've had that. I kind of, any of the people I deal with internationally, I want to pay them in Bitcoin and I want them to pay me in Bitcoin. And now I kind of guard my Bitcoin a little bit more safely because I've had that aha moment and I kind of get it.
Yes.
But I think most people on crypto Twitter probably haven't even had an aha moment. They've just traded.
Yes. That's absolutely true. And that's the difference. That's the fundamental difference between treating this as a speculative investment and using it as part of your income, earning Bitcoin rather than buying Bitcoin. And that applies to all crypto. You start treating it fundamentally different when you earn it and use it in your day-to-day. Then you start having aha moments. Otherwise, you just have a roller coaster ride that is mostly dopamine and fear-driven, and it does not give you insights into the purpose or importance of this technology. It simply becomes a gambling thing. And that's why I discourage people from approaching it from that angle. People say, well, what should I do to get into Bitcoin? And my advice is not sign up for an exchange, give them all of your ID, buy some, hold it, and see what happens. That is not good advice. My advice is always, what do you do for a living? What do you do for a hobby? Can you do that plus crypto for those who want to? Cut hair for Bitcoin. Drive a car for Bitcoin. Sell baklava for Bitcoin. And then use it to collaborate with other people across the world even simple things like tipping with it is a more meaningful experience than simply the investment speculation.
I haven't had my aha moment with Ethereum yet.
Yeah, good. I haven't either. I've had a couple of moments that came close. I mean, I've learned a lot more by writing the book. I don't think Ethereum is yet at the point where um, many of the really important applications have matured. But really, you've got to recognize that one of the things that Ethereum did is it created an environment for yet another burst of crowdfunding in the form of ICOs. From one perspective, probably the majority perspective for the majority of these issuances, it was scamtastic all across the board. And disappointing in terms of it attracted a lot of the sharks that infect the entire ecosystem with their greed. But it also introduced a wedge into the fairly stagnant VC market, especially internationally, where VC isn't as developed as it is in, say, California. And it showed us a glimpse of what could happen in terms of governance and crowdfunding for applications in the future, especially applications that people don't want to run, where there are interests against running them or interests to shut them down. What I believe is one of the key elements of Ethereum, which is unstoppable code. It hasn't yet matured to the point where there's really any strong applications. The other one that's really interesting to me is games. And I think a bit with CryptoKitties, a bit with a couple of the other games. I mean, at the moment, they're very silly, they're very basic, they're very mature. But again, just like FTP in the early internet, giving you a glimpse of what happens when you open data to the world, if you have a bit of vision or experience with technology, you can already see the seeds in that. Gaming might be the breakout application for Ethereum specifically. It's well suited to that kind of application, and that's an enormous application. That's TV, radio, music, theater, and movies combined are smaller than the video gaming industry. And so, it's not a silly thing to have the possibility of building cross-game economies at scale with the ability to establish ownership over assets, in-game assets like non-fungible tokens, which is the technology and the terminology used in Ethereum. I find that exciting. I haven't had the aha moment yet, but I can see a glimmer of it.
But I keep company with maximalists at times, and I'm not there myself. Sometimes I think I might be, and sometimes I think I'm just a sympathizer. But whenever I talk to them, they're like, if you support Ethereum, you don't understand money. So what is it the maximalists don't get about Ethereum?
If you can't see the value or the possibilities in Ethereum, I would say you don't understand software. And that's okay. Not everybody has to understand software. Not everybody has to understand money. And those two are not 100% overlapping in a Venn diagram, right? There are different domains. And those two different domains have different motivations and different reward schemes and different sweet points, if you like, or friction points. The bottom line here is that I find maximalism to be a very, very slippery topic. And part of the reason is that, there is no definition. I mean, maximalism was coined as a term primarily in a derogatory fashion by Vitalik, because he was mocking that perspective. Whenever I try to pin down maximalism, the goalposts keep moving, and there's a lot of no true Scotsman fallacy being bandied around. But here's what I see from the maximalist. Well, that's not a true maximalist. No, I'm the true maximalist. They're just pretend maximalists. I have the real doctrine. And so it's a very slippery concept. And I don't think it's a useful label, right? It's not a useful label for the people who identify with it, and it's even less of a useful label for those who criticize maximalism because it's too broad and too poorly defined. So are we talking about monetary maximalism? Are we talking about platform maximalism? Are we talking about maximalism as in, there will be only one? Highlander maximalism, I'll call it. There can be only one. Or is it the Pareto maximalism? It's going to be a nice power law distribution where 60 to 80% of the market capitalization or use cases will be expressed by one dominant system and then a long tail of thousands of competitors. These are very different forms of maximalism. Some are very absolutist, some are very mild. Like if you want to claim that in the narrow area of monetary applications, not platform applications, but monetary applications, things that only have economic value or predominantly have economic value, that there will be a power law distribution where the majority of value will be captured by a system that expresses sound monetary policies. I'm a maximalist. There you go. I'm a monetary Pareto maximalist. But that is meaningless, right? Because that has nothing to do with the claims being made against, say, Ethereum or other systems, where it's not about monetary maximalism and it's certainly not about Pareto maximalism. So again, not a useful term. I don't really care. I get to choose what I want to use. And to me, the fact that other things exist in the ecosystem do not bother me. I like to take a live and let live, use and let use attitude to this, which is it doesn't detract from my value or my appreciation or my future if you decide to use something different. And I don't feel the need to criticize that choice or to correct people on that. If you have a different opinion and a different perspective, good, enjoy, do your thing. I don't see the value in maximalism as this strident persuade everyone movement that which at least in my experience on my Twitter feed is extremely intolerant of any opinion that deviates, and it's very doctrinal, and I find that limiting. I think
that's fair. And certainly, I listened to your interview with Stefan, and that kind of, I was sat in the gym listening to it. I was like, okay, yeah, I kind of get it. I see, there is no harm in other projects, and there's no harm in Ethereum. But then I'm like, well, but it is still a traded asset, and people could lose money, and I know they can lose it on Bitcoin. And there's kind of big grand plans, and I'm not a technical person, Andreas, but unstoppable software sounds like a great dream. But
of course they could lose money. Absolutely, they could lose money. You see, the thing is, my interest and work in relation to Ethereum has nothing to do with a tradable asset. The tradable asset, in fact, is counterproductive in the use of Ethereum. One of the things that Ethereum maximalists don't get, to switch this a tiny bit, is that if your tradable utility token becomes valuable in a monetary sense, it destroys the utility aspect, meaning that you can't use it to run an efficient network where fees arbitrage between different uses of software that's running on the network, because it becomes too expensive to fucking run and the friction is too high. So, the other aspect of this is a successful Ether platform that creates a successful Ether investment destroys the software platform. And that's what people don't get.
But then how do you have an incentive? What's the incentive to run the system?
You need an incentive, but that incentive is a unit of account for computation. It is not a store of value. And that is a very different function. A unit of account for computation is absolutely needed to prevent denial of service and an attrition of the network. You need that as an incentive mechanism. But if that ever becomes even slightly a store of value, it destroys the other function.
Would Ethereum be better if the incentive was paid in Bitcoin?
Perhaps, but no, for a very specific reason. By the way, when Vitalik shared the white paper, it was about 3 weeks before he published it, and he sent it to me and I read it, and I immediately wanted to get on a call with him, and I Skyped him first question I ask them is, why is not Bitcoin the unit here? Why are you doing this on another blockchain? And I'm still satisfied with the answer I got, which is, here's the issue. The fundamental issue here is that you need a set of consensus rules to validate the software itself. So the smart contracts have to be within the domain of validation of the consensus rules. One of the problems you see with things like Counterparty, Omni, and other layers on Bitcoin is that the tokens or smart contracts that are operating within that environment are not subject to the underlying consensus rules of Bitcoin, right? This is a fundamental problem because it puts them outside of the security model. And you can have various effects where essentially there's how do I put this? There's boundary violations between the layers, right? So you can do things above the consensus layer in the software that affect what's happening below and vice versa. So that argument says that in order for a platform for smart contracts to be effective, the smart contracts have to be subject to the consensus rules. Well, if the smart contracts are subject to the consensus rules and the unit of account for computation is subject to the consensus rules, and in fact, that is the critical component, that unit of account has to also be within the same consensus rules. You can't have that unit of account be in a different system under different consensus rules. They have to be in the same domain so that the security model is internally consistent, so that you can't have boundary violations between the two. An attack on one should not succeed without an attack on the other. So that explanation, and Vitalik explained it much better than I did just now, that has still been satisfying for me since 2014. And it forms my understanding of why platform blockchains work differently than monetary blockchains, and why they still need an incentive system, but it has to be of a different nature. But again, it doesn't freaking matter. If people invest in this and treat it as an investment instead of a platform and lose money, that's on them. And in fact, it's a useful teaching experience for them. And it's a lesson for the broader blockchain ecosystem. Here's the thing. I'll be brutally honest with you. I think maximalism is a fear response. I think it is no coincidence that maximalism, and I'm not talking just about Bitcoin maximalism, because I see the same in Ethereum maximalism and EOS maximalism and Tron maximalism and Ripple maximalism. Oh, absolutely Ripple maximalism. In every one of these domains, one of the things that I've noticed is it emerged most strongly after the precipitous decline in 2018. And when the pie shrinks and you start feeling that this might be a zero-sum game and the market is not necessarily aligned with your idea of which one should win, suddenly there is a lot of kind of turning inwards, circling the wagons and trying to defend the turf that exists. And now, because it's seen as a zero-sum game, someone being interested or investing in the other thing automatically means that that happens at the expense of your thing. So everybody gets much more defensive. I'm maximally confident about Bitcoin and minimally maximalist. And the reason I'm maximally confident is because I believe it doesn't need to be defended from competition. I don't think it needs to be clarified to other people that their choices are wrong and yours is right. I don't think that we need to keep emphasizing that this is the only path forward, because, first of all, because it's not, but secondly, because even if it was, that's unnecessary. If it is, it will show it on itself. And I'm confident that the market will operate to make to discover the truth of which system is best for which application. And because of that confidence, I don't feel the need to, fence around that position, circle the wagons and defend it. I think I'm more confident about Bitcoin than some of the maximalists out there. Or self-proclaimed maximalist. I think a lot of that, and I'm not judging here, right? Fear is something that everybody experiences. It's something that is very difficult to reconcile. It also creates, and this is key, fear has been proven scientifically to magnify cognitive biases. When people are acting under the influence of adrenaline and stress hormones, is the worst possible time to do analytical thinking, because the brain automatically shuts down those areas of analysis. Your frontal cortex shuts down. This is something that is useful to know for any human being, because the worst time to try to evaluate why you're terrified, upset, depressed, whatever, is when you're terrified, depressed, or whatever. Because what happens is confirmation bias, selection bias, survivor bias, black and white thinking are magnified by the influence of adrenaline and stress hormones on the brain, which means that the very thing we're trying to use to work out why we're in this situation has been compromised by the hormones flowing through our brain. Maximalism is a natural thing. That I think it's a reaction of fear, because when people are scared, they've made an investment, they've committed a big chunk of their lives, and I can totally empathize with that. I feel the same at times. That is the worst time to try to evaluate the evidence for and against your position. Your brain can't do that. You're going to fall prey to all of the cognitive biases. So I think it's a fear response, and I think we're going to see maximalism gradually dissipate once things get fun again. Once the market recovers and people seem to be agreeing with your position, I don't think people will find the need to defend these positions as strongly. And again, I'm trying very hard to not sound patronizing. I'm not judging here. I've been there. We all operate from fear at times. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just not a very helpful tool to make decisions.
I mean, I wouldn't say everyone does it from fear. I think for some people it's a rational dislike for other projects. There's a lot of people would say,
some people, some of the time.
But you don't need to put like unstoppable software on a blockchain, or can you even do it? At scale. Like at scale, can this even be done? Because there's an awful lot of information that's stored in software, right? So I think there's a variety of reasons. I think fear's one. I agree with you there, but I do also think some of it's from a rational point of view, some is from a technical point of view. There will always be different reasons.
But why? What is the motivation in what is essentially an attempt to prove a negative? Because from a rational point of view, you can't put software on a blockchain, or you can't scale a blockchain to do software, or you can't X, Y, Z, is fundamentally proving a negative. And the simple answer in technology is, if you paint yourself into a corner where you use words like can't or never, technology has a way of making you look like a fool within a very short period of time. I look at it from the exact opposite perspective, which is that there is enormous benefit from people trying to do these things that other people say cannot be done. In fact, I think we've seen some of the most important developments in the research of scaling come out of the fact that Ethereum scales like a dog. It sucks at scaling, and it has to scale in order to fulfill its mission. And as a result, it puts pressure on the research. It effectively puts evolutionary pressure on the system to go in a certain direction where scaling is very, very important research, and therefore it's getting funded, it's getting attention, it's getting researchers to do it. On the other hand, Bitcoin needs to go in the direction of privacy. And fortunately, especially due to surveillance attacks and things like that, that's getting a lot of emphasis. So can't is not a rational position. It's in fact, it's an unfalsifiable position, right? A rational position is one that is based on what it can do, right? Saying that it can't do something is simply a matter of where you put the goalposts and how you set the time frame.
I guess sometimes then maybe it's because it has a net negative, or has Ethereum had a net positive or a net negative on the world so far? If you look at everything, the scams and the money lost, I mean, I would probably say it's in the net negative now. Can it become a net positive? Perhaps, maybe it can be.
No, I disagree entirely. And I think that same criticism from that same perspective could be levied on Bitcoin, and it's a fundamental mistake to see value selectively.
I'm not sure I agree.
The same argument could be made that Bitcoin's a net negative because the vast majority of its use cases lie in illicit, illegal drug seeking and gambling behaviors.
Yeah, but we know that's factually not true.
I don't actually know that that's factually not true. I think there was a study done. It was like less than 5% of transactions are illicit. Are you counting speculative investment as gambling in that? Because I am. And I would consider that a net negative.
I wouldn't call investing negative because speculative investing is investing.
I think the fundamental motivations behind the majority of people, especially during a boom bust cycle, has been greed, FOMO, and is not based on any rational understanding of how Bitcoin works, but simply...
Yeah, but hold on. It's still an investment and it's an investable product. Like all investment is based on, at one level, on greed. It's a spectrum of greed, but it's still a spectrum. It's still an investment.
Yes, I understand. But by the way, I'm not making that argument. I think the outcome is net positive because even in the case of greed and gambling and all of that, you get positive externalities. You get learning about investments. You get learning and exposure to the technology, and it funds research that improves the technology. And I would make the exact same argument for all of the ICO scams. The people who got burned choose to do so because of greed. They get penalized by the market. They learn a lesson, and they also fund a ton of activities, some of which train developers who may eventually leave that ICO once it crashes and go and work on something more productive because the market will weed out the bullshit. And I trust in that process, and that process of creative destruction, of attempt and failure, and even the greed-driven motivations behind it are net positive in the long run.
Well, but hold on, you can't say in the long run because it hasn't happened yet. We don't know if it'll be net positive in the future.
No, we don't. And that's the problem with saying can't or trying to measure success on a fixed time frame, which is that
that's a fair point.
We don't know if you just keep moving the goalposts. I was having this conversation with Stefan recently, but the idea that so Bitcoin will become the only reserve currency. Right. When? In 10 years. So the explosion of alts we've seen now is a temporary phenomenon and is going to reverse itself into a singularity. So we go from a Big Bang Cambrian explosion to alts, which then, due to gravitation, monetary gravitation, reverses itself into a singularity, and everything converges back into Bitcoin and everything else goes away. Yes, maybe that requires setting a very specific timetable in which you're going to be wrong for a very long time until you're finally vindicated as being right. To me, that doesn't matter. We can't predict how these things are going to go, and we can't evaluate whether they're net positive or net negative unless we take an arbitrary time frame. And anybody who's a proponent is going to keep moving the goalposts and say, we're going to have success anytime now. And anybody who's negative is going to say, move the goalposts again and say, it's going to collapse into a singularity anytime now. None of which is productive, right? None of which is predictive. And so I'm much more interested in just seeing how it plays out. And I feel very, very fortunate to have the opportunity to observe this from a position of knowledge and learning and involvement than to be on the sidelines. To me, that's a blessing, the fact that I can be actively involved in these spaces and watch them evolve from up close.
Yeah, it's funny because despite what we've just discussed now, it was actually listening to Stefan's show that I've become a little bit more open-minded to Ethereum, and there's things happening that I can't ignore. I do think it's still, there's a lot to prove. I personally think so far it's been a net negative, but I do think there's things being built that I can't ignore. I can't ignore MakerDAO. I just can't ignore it. So,
Right. I mean, that is a fascinating application of financial engineering that, quite honestly, can't be done on Bitcoin. And that's okay that it can't be done, because the compromises in security that would be required to pull off something like that on Bitcoin are not worth doing, because they would destroy the features that I care about in Bitcoin. So there's space for that. Now, is that going to be a killer app? Is it going to work? Is it going to succeed? Is it going to scale? I don't know. I'll tell you one thing. All of these questions motivate me to ask more questions and learn. They don't motivate me to go back to basics and focus only on one thing. They actually motivate me to go read more broadly. Part of the reason for that is because, one, I'm curious. I'm very curious. Two, I'm a geek. I really enjoy technology, not for any end goal, but purely for the elegance of design, the intellectual stimulation, the interaction with other people who think the same way as me, the looking into the future and imagining different scenarios that come out of it. And I'm going to continue to explore those things. That's the most fun part of this. And at the same time, here's the most important thing. I am very suspicious of certainty. I am not certain about any of this. And I think anybody who claims to be certain needs to consider some of the blind spots. We all have them. And if you believe you don't have any blind spots, that's a very big blind spot.
Well, I've already overstepped my mark. I think that's a great point to end. So, firstly, thank you, Andreas, for coming on. I probably could have talked to you for another 12 hours. And I'd love to do it again in the future.
Absolutely. Let's just pick up from here and do it in a few months or whatever, and just continue the conversation. It's been a pleasure.
I want to do it in person. I try and do, I think about half of mine have been done in person. I prefer that. We'll find a time. We'll get to a conference together. Just tell people how they can follow you. Give a shout out to your Patreon.
Antonop, Antonop, on Twitter, on YouTube. People who support me on Patreon allow me to scale and deliver better results with a big team of behind me who help me leverage my work. And Twitter, of course.
Brilliant. Great to have you on. Can't wait to do this again sometime. Thank you.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Okay, so how was that? How amazing is Andreas? I mean, how many of us have been down his YouTube rabbit hole, video after video of his super interesting ways of looking at things? I did it pretty early on. I think most people turn around and say, I discovered Bitcoin. Then I started watching Andreas videos. He just gets it and he just gets us. I think he's amazing. I love the guy. And I'm aware that some maximalists are questioning his opinions on Ethereum. They've kind of got some issues with it. But I have to say, listening to him on my show, but also on Stefan's, I can kind of appreciate some of his points. I think something like DAI is hard to ignore. And I'm aware I've got this floating opinion with regards to this, and this might not be helpful to some people, but I have to go with my gut instinct and pursue things. And I think he makes a good argument. So I'm actually quite looking forward to discussing this with Pierre Rochard when I see him next, because I'm sure he's going to absolutely crush my thoughts on this brutally. But yes, he's definitely opened my mind a little bit more back into the world of Ethereum and altcoins and the reality that they will exist. So anyway, listen, I hope you enjoyed the interview. If you'd like to discuss it, you can reach out to me. My email address is hello@whatbitcoindid.com. And also, thank you to everybody who supports the show. From those who leave me a review on iTunes, those who sponsor the podcast, if you just share it out with your friends and family, whatever you do, thank you so much. If you do want to support the show, though, there's so many things you can do. It's all listed on my website. But firstly, and most importantly, and I always say this, please just listen to the advertisers. It is the likes of BlockFi and Kraken that make it so I can do this. So make sure you just check them out, have a listen to what they've got to say, because that really does help the show. But if you don't want to listen to the ads, plenty of people don't, and they just pay to get rid of them. They become a patron. So if you head over to patreon.com/whatbitcoindid for $5 a month, you can get the shows early and you get them without ads, and you get it without all my nonsense waffling on at the start and the finish. I've got 85 now. It's really insane. I'm looking forward to hitting 100. I'm going to do some kind of giveaway with that. I think I've got to say thank you for that. If you don't want to use Patreon, but you want to subscribe to the ad-free version, you can do so with crypto. You can pay with Bitcoin. You can pay on Lightning, whatever. Just drop me an email. I'll give you an address and I can add you to the distribution list. You can just tip the show. It's funny. I didn't want to do this at the start, and now I have. I've received quite a lot with it. One person the other day tipped me a whole Bitcoin, which is absolutely mad. So very cool. Thank you to that person. But yeah, you can tip the show. That's on my website. If you want to become a show sponsor, then drop me an email on hello@whatbitcoindid.com. Downloads are continuing to grow. I've just done my February report, nearly hit 150,000 downloads for the month, which honestly, I'm blown away by. It's utterly insane. I'm sold out till the middle of the March. I've got one slot available for the rest of March and in April. If you're interested in taking that, then drop me an email. We can get on the phone. We can discuss it. You can leave me a review on iTunes or click on the subscribe button. Both help with the ranking of the show. You can follow me on social media. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Medium. I'm at What Bitcoin Did on everything. My personal Twitter is at Peter McCormack. DMs are always open. Feel free to get in touch. Just don't send me any nonsense. Check out my website. That's www.whatbitcoindid.com, and you can sign up to my newsletter there. And feel free to share the show out with your friends and family. Super useful for increasing the reach of the show. Okay, sorry about doing that every week, but it does help. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm in the States. I've got this crazy schedule. I'm heading over to Chicago in a couple of days, then Boston, Hong Kong, LA, Denver, Austin, and then maybe Nashville before I head back to New York. I'm basically just going out to get as many interviews as I can in person because I always prefer that. I've got so many great interviews coming up. I'm sitting down with Pomp tomorrow where we're going to shoot some questions back and forward at each other. I've got Amber Ball Day coming up. I've got interviews with Eric Voorhees, Chris Banitsky, and I've also got Crypto Cobain lined up, which is going to be super interesting. So it's going to be a busy, crazy month. Feel free to get in touch. My email address is hello@whatbitcoindid.com, and I look forward to hearing from you.